A judge sentences a black woman to death row, unaware she's a federal prosecutor, the only person who could have saved him. As the gavel slams, a note lands on his desk. You just doomed yourself. Too late, he realizes. Evidence was missing, witnesses were silenced, and now someone is covering their tracks. Can he undo his own verdict before her time runs out? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Daniel Santos adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. His stern gaze swept across the packed gallery before settling on Angela Monroe. She stood tall at the defendant's table, her dark suit crisp and professional despite weeks of trial. The jury has reached a verdict, Judge Santos announced, his voice echoing through the hushed chamber. In the matter of the state versus Angela Monroe. Angela's hands remained steady, though her attorney noticed a slight tremor in her shoulders. The media had painted her as a cold-blooded killer, but something in her eyes spoke of determination rather than guilt. We find the defendant guilty, the jury foreman declared. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Angela's face remained composed, but her complexion turned ashen. Her defense attorney placed a comforting hand on her arm. Judge Santos cleared his throat. Ms. Monroe, you have been found guilty of first-degree murder. The severity of this crime, combined with the overwhelming evidence presented, leaves this court with only one option. He paused, his fingers tightening around his gavel. I hereby sentence you to death by lethal injection. Your Honor, Angela spoke, her voice unwavering. I am innocent. The evidence you mention, there are crucial pieces missing. Someone has orchestrated this entire... That's enough, Ms. Monroe, Judge Santos cut her off. This court has heard your claims throughout the trial. The jury has spoken. As bailiffs led Angela away, a young clerk hurried forward with a stack of papers. Among them was a plain white envelope, unmarked except for the judge's name. Santos almost dismissed it, but something made him open it right there on the bench. The handwritten message inside made his blood run cold. You just sentenced the only person who could have saved you. Judge Santos's hand trembled as he read the words again. For the first time in his 20-year career, doubt crept into his mind. He looked up sharply, watching as Angela disappeared through the courtroom doors. Her final words about missing evidence suddenly carried new weight. The prosecutor was already packing his briefcase, a satisfied smile on his face. The defense attorney slumped in his chair, defeated. Jury members filed out, some avoiding eye contact, others looking troubled despite their verdict. Santos sat alone at his bench, the letter burning in his hands like a hot coal. The confident certainty he'd felt just moments ago began to crumble. What had he missed? What had they all missed? He thought back to Angela's calm demeanor throughout the trial, her insistence about deeper corruption, the strange gaps in the prosecution's timeline that he'd dismissed. Now, with these 7 chilling words before him, every certainty began to unravel. The emptying courtroom felt suddenly suffocating. Judge Santos loosened his collar, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of his gavel. The weight of what he might have just done pressed down on him like a physical force. Angela Monroe walked between 2 prison guards, her head held high despite the rattling of chains around her wrists and ankles. The concrete corridors echoed with their footsteps as they led her deeper into the maximum security wing. Special accommodations, one guard muttered, unlocking a heavy steel door. Solitary. For your protection. The cell was barely 8 feet square, with a narrow cot bolted to the wall and a small steel toilet in the corner. Angela stood in the center as they removed her restraints, her expression unchanged even as the door clanged shut behind her. Across town, Judge Santos adjusted his bow tie in the mirror of the Grand Plaza Hotel's bathroom. The anonymous letter sat in his breast pocket, its presence impossible to ignore. Ridiculous, he whispered to his reflection, but his hands wouldn't stop fidgeting. The ballroom buzzed with Sacramento's legal elite. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in white linen. Santos made his way to the podium, accepting handshakes and congratulations for the high-profile conviction. "Justice must be unwavering," he declared to the assembled crowd. "Today's verdict proves that no one is above the law, regardless of their position or connections." As applause filled the room, a man in a rumpled suit approached the judge's table. His press badge identified him as Noah Fields from the Sacramento Tribune. "Judge Santos," Fields said quietly, sliding into an empty chair. "Interesting speech about justice. But what about the missing security footage from the parking garage? Or the witness who changed their story 3 times? Santos felt his chest tighten. "The jury found the evidence conclusive, Mr. Fields." "Did they?" Fields raised an eyebrow. "Or did they see what they were meant to see?" The judge's fingers brushed against the letter in his pocket. The same unease that had plagued him since reading it grew stronger, but he maintained his stern demeanor. "If you'll excuse me," Santos said stiffly, rising from his seat. "I have other guests to attend to." But as he walked away, Fields' words echoed in his mind, mixing with Angela Monroe's final statement in court. For the first time in his career, Judge Santos felt the foundation of his certainty beginning to crack. Late into the night, Judge Santos sat in his dimly lit home office, surrounded by stacks of case files from Angela Monroe's trial. His reading glasses perched on his nose as he flipped through document after document, his frown deepening. "This can't be right," he muttered, comparing 2 witness statements. The timestamps didn't match. And where was the full forensics report? Pages were clearly missing. His cell phone buzzed, an unknown number. "Judge Santos speaking," he answered, his voice tight with exhaustion. "It's Noah Fields." The journalist's voice was hushed, urgent. "I have proof that Monroe was set up. Hard evidence that'll blow this whole thing wide open." Santos sat up straighter. "What kind of proof?" "Not over the phone. They're watching. All I can say is that the murder weapon, it wasn't what you think." Before Santos could press further, Fields hung up. The next evening, Santos nursed a scotch at the judge's chamber, an upscale bar where the city's legal community often gathered. The leather booth creaked as Judge Harold Whitmore slid in across from him. "Danny," Whitmore said, his usually jovial face serious. "Word is you're poking around the Monroe case again." Santos set down his glass. "Just reviewing the files, Harold. Standard procedure." Whitmore leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Listen to me carefully, old friend. Some very influential people worked hard to close this case. People who don't appreciate loose ends." "Are you threatening me, Harold?" "Threatening?" Whitmore forced a laugh, but his eyes remained cold. "I'm trying to help you. You've got a perfect record, a sterling reputation. Why risk it all over one case?" He stood up, straightening his expensive suit. "Sometimes justice means knowing when to let sleeping dogs lie." Santos watched his colleague walk away, the warning hanging heavy in the air. He thought of the missing files, Fields' cryptic call, and Angela Monroe's unwavering insistence of innocence. For the first time in his career, he felt the weight of doubt crushing his chest. In his chambers, Judge Santos typed Angela Monroe's name into the legal database. His eyes widened as articles filled the screen. "Rising star prosecutor takes down crime syndicate." "Monroe's anti-corruption unit secures record convictions." "My God," he whispered, scrolling through her impressive career. She had been a federal prosecutor with a near-perfect conviction rate, specializing in corruption cases. The woman he'd sentenced to death wasn't some random lawyer. She was one of the Justice Department's most effective prosecutors. Meanwhile, in the sterile prison visiting room, Angela Monroe sat across from Detective Carla Reyes, her former investigative partner. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on both women's faces. "You look terrible," Carla said softly, noting the dark circles under Angela's eyes. "Prison will do that to you." Angela managed a weak smile. "Why are you here, Carla?" Carla glanced at the guard standing by the door, then leaned forward. "Things are moving, Angela. Keep your head down and stay strong. Help is coming." Angela's hands trembled slightly. "What do you mean?" "I can't say more. Just trust me, like old times." Back in his chambers, Santos dug deeper into the case files. As he lifted a stack of papers, a manila envelope slipped out from between the pages, unmarked and unsealed. His heart pounding, he opened it. Inside was an official Justice Department memo dated just 2 weeks before Angela's arrest. His hands shook as he read, "Prosecutor Monroe's preliminary investigation indicates widespread judicial corruption in the Southern District. Multiple judges implicated. Further surveillance authorized." Santos sank into his chair, the document nearly slipping from his fingers. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Angela Monroe hadn't been just any prosecutor. She had been investigating corrupt judges right before she was arrested. The anonymous note's warning echoed in his mind. "You just sentenced the only person who could have saved you." Now he understood. She wasn't just another defendant. She was a threat to someone powerful enough to frame her for murder and manipulate the entire justice system to put her away. Santos carefully returned the document to its envelope, his judicial calm cracking under the weight of this revelation. Everything about the case, every inconsistency, every missing piece, it all suddenly made terrible sense. Judge Santos sat in a dimly lit coffee shop, his hands wrapped around a cooling cup of black coffee. Across from him, Noah Fields spread out a stack of documents on the scratched wooden table. "Look at this," Noah said, pointing to a highlighted section. 2 days before her arrest, Angela Monroe subpoenaed these bank records. They show suspicious transfers between offshore accounts and several prominent figures in our justice system. Santos's throat went dry as he recognized some of the names. "These are my colleagues." "Exactly." Noah's voice dropped lower. "She was closing in on them. Then suddenly, she's accused of murder? The timing isn't a coincidence." Later that afternoon, Santos marched into Judge Whitmore's chambers without knocking. Whitmore looked up from his desk, his face darkening. "We need to talk about Angela Monroe," Santos said firmly. Whitmore's jaw tightened. "I thought I made myself clear. Drop it. She was investigating judicial corruption before her arrest. Did you know about this?" "Daniel," Whitmore stood up, his voice sharp with warning. "You're stepping into dangerous territory. Think about your career. Think about your family." "Are you threatening me, Harold?" "I'm trying to protect you." Whitmore moved closer, his usually composed demeanor cracking. "Walk away from this. Now." That night, Santos couldn't sleep. He sat in his home office, reviewing copies of the documents Noah had shared. At 2 a.m., a crash from downstairs jolted him awake. His heart pounding, he crept to the landing. Shadows moved through his living room. The beam of a flashlight swept across the walls. Santos backed away silently, but a floorboard creaked beneath his foot. The flashlight beam swung toward the stairs. He rushed to his office and locked the door, fumbling for his phone. Heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs. The office door shuddered under impact. Santos backed away, clutching his phone. Another slam, and the doorframe splintered. 2 masked figures burst in. One went straight for his laptop, while the other grabbed the case files from his desk. They worked with frightening efficiency, ignoring Santos completely. In less than a minute, they were gone, leaving Santos standing in his violated office, shaking. All his evidence about Angela Monroe's case, everything that could prove her innocence, was gone. Only then did he notice the paper they had deliberately left on his desk. In bold letters, "Final warning." Judge Santos sat alone in his study, surrounded by decades of legal texts and awards that now felt hollow. His hands trembled as he held a framed photo from his swearing-in ceremony. The proud smile on his younger face mocked him. "Everything I believed in," he whispered. setting the photo face down. All those years, was it all built on lies? Across town, in a quiet corner of Palmer Park, Detective Carla Reyes waited on a bench, her collar turned up against the cold. Noah Fields approached, carrying a manila envelope. "You sure you weren't followed?" Carla asked, scanning the area. Noah sat beside her. "I'm sure. What do you have?" Carla pulled out a small USB drive. Bank statements. Officers Martinez and Thompson both received large deposits 2 days before testifying against Angela. The money traced back to the same shell company that's connected to the judges you're investigating. Noah's eyes widened as he reviewed the documents. "This is it. This proves they were bought off." He looked up at Carla. Their testimony was crucial in convicting her. "And there's more," Carla added, her voice tight with anger. "Both officers got promotions within months of the trial. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say?" The next morning, Judge Santos walked into Millbrook Correctional Facility, his judicial badge displayed prominently. The guard at the front desk barely glanced at his credentials before shaking his head. "I'm sorry, Your Honor. No visitors allowed for inmate Monroe." "I'm a sitting judge," Santos insisted, struggling to keep his voice level. "I presided over her case." The prison warden, Marcus Chen, emerged from his office. "Judge Santos, may I have a word?" Inside the warden's office, Chen closed the door carefully. "Your Honor, with all due respect, you're asking too many questions about Monroe's case." "I have the right to—" "You have the right to nothing here," Chen cut in, his friendly demeanor vanishing. "This is my facility, and I'm telling you, for your own good, walk away." Santos leaned forward. "Are you threatening a federal judge?" "No, sir." Chen smiled thinly. "I'm protecting one. There are people who wouldn't appreciate you. Reopening old wounds." Santos stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "The fact that you're trying to stop me from seeing her only proves something is very wrong here." "That's your choice to make," Chen replied, opening his office door. "But remember, you were warned." As Santos walked to his car, his phone buzzed with a text from Noah. "Got proof. Officers were paid off. Meeting tonight?" Santos stared at the message, his world tilting on its axis. If the police testimony was bought, if judges were involved, if the whole system was corrupted, then everything he'd devoted his life to defending was a lie. The courthouse archive was eerily quiet as Judge Santos made his way through the dimly lit basement. The musty smell of old papers filled the air as he approached the front desk where Mrs. Peterson, the elderly archivist, peered at him over her reading glasses. "I need the complete files for case number 2023 CR 789, Santos said, trying to keep his voice steady. "The Monroe trial." Mrs. Peterson's fingers flew across her keyboard, her brow furrowed. "That's odd," she muttered. "Several files are marked as destroyed in a flooding incident last week." She looked up at Santos. "But we haven't had any water damage down here." Santos felt his stomach drop. "What about the witness testimonies? The evidence logs?" "Gone. All of them." Mrs. Peterson shook her head. "Someone's been tampering with our records, Your Honor, and they didn't want anyone to notice." Meanwhile, in her prison cell, Angela Monroe stared at her dinner tray. The bland prison food hardly registered as she noticed something unusual, a small piece of paper tucked beneath her bread roll. Her heart racing, she carefully slipped it into her palm. Once the guard passed her cell, Angela unfolded the note with trembling fingers. 7 words were written in neat handwriting. "He knows. But will he act?" Angela closed her eyes, hope flickering in her chest for the first time in months. Someone on the outside hadn't forgotten about her. Someone was fighting for the truth. Later that evening, Judge Santos left the courthouse, his mind churning with questions. The missing files couldn't be a coincidence. As he drove down the dark country road leading to his house, His foot pressed the brake pedal to slow for a curve. Nothing happened. His heart lurched as he pumped the pedal again. The car continued to speed forward. The brake lines had been cut. The curve approached rapidly. Santos yanked the emergency brake and twisted the wheel, but the car was moving too fast. The world spun as his vehicle left the road, tumbling down the embankment. Metal screamed against earth. Glass shattered. Santos felt the impact of the airbag, then nothing but pain and darkness. When he came to, he was hanging upside down, held in place by his seatbelt. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead. Through the shattered windshield, he could see his headlights illuminating the trees at strange angles. With shaking hands, he reached for his phone and dialed 911. As he waited for help, one thought crystallized in his mind. This was no accident. Someone had tried to kill him to keep him from discovering the truth. The message was clear. He was getting too close. But instead of scaring him away, the attempt on his life only strengthened his resolve. Angela Monroe wasn't the only victim of this corruption, and now he knew exactly how far these people would go to keep their secrets. In the sterile hospital room, Judge Santos lay propped up against white pillows, his face bruised and bandaged. Detective Carla Reyes stood by his bedside, her dark eyes filled with concern. "You're lucky to be alive," she said softly, pulling a chair closer. "But this wasn't luck or coincidence. Someone's been watching you." Santos tried to sit up straighter, wincing at the pain in his ribs. "What do you mean?" "My team found surveillance equipment near your house, your office, even your favorite coffee shop." Reyes pulled out her phone, showing him photos. "They've been tracking your every move for days." A nurse came in to check Santos's vitals, and they waited in tense silence until she left. Just then, Noah Fields burst through the door, clutching a manila envelope. "Judge, you need to see this." Fields spread documents across the hospital tray table. "I followed the money. Thomas Weber, the prosecution's star witness, who claimed he saw Angela at the crime scene. He received $100,000 in offshore payments 2 days before his testimony." Santos's hands trembled as he examined the bank statements. "This proves the testimony was bought." "There's more," Reyes said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Angela's original defense attorney, James Mitchell, his car accident wasn't an accident at all." Santos felt the blood drain from his face. "What?" "He died 3 weeks before the trial. The brake lines were cut, just like yours." Reyes leaned forward. "And his replacement, Lawrence Turner. We've traced payments from him to Judge Harold Whitmore's private account." "Turner deliberately threw the case," Fields added. "He ignored key evidence, failed to call crucial witnesses, and rushed through the defense. He was working for them the whole time." Santos closed his eyes, feeling sick. The entire trial had been orchestrated from the start. They had used his reputation for being tough on crime against him, knowing he would deliver the verdict they wanted, and he had played right into their hands. "How deep does this go?" he asked, opening his eyes to look at Reyes and Fields. "We're still uncovering layers," Reyes replied. "But one thing's clear. They wanted Angela Monroe silenced, and they used the justice system to do it." A nurse appeared in the doorway. "I'm sorry, but visiting hours are over. The patient needs rest." As Reyes and Fields gathered their documents, Santos grabbed Reyes's arm. "Keep digging," he whispered, "and watch your back." In a dimly lit corner booth of a quiet diner, Judge Daniel Santos met with Elliot Parker, his mentor from law school. Parker's hands shook as he slid a thick manila envelope across the table. "What I'm about to show you could get us both killed," Parker whispered, his weathered face etched with worry. "But I can't stay silent anymore." Santos opened the envelope, his heart pounding as he examined the contents. Internal memos, private communications, and bank statements revealed a disturbing pattern. Judge Harold Whitmore had manipulated every aspect of Angela Monroe's trial from behind the scenes. He handpicked the jury members, Parker explained, pointing to highlighted names. And look at the dates. He met with the prosecution team 17 times before the trial. That's unprecedented. Meanwhile, in the cold confines of her prison cell, Angela Monroe stood face to face with guard Jenkins, a hulking man with cold eyes. He cornered her during her solitary exercise time. "Heard you've been getting some interesting visitors lately," Jenkins sneered, tapping his baton against the wall. "Let me make something real clear. Even if you somehow dodge that needle, you won't last long in here. Accidents happen all the time in prison." Angela felt her heart race but kept her expression neutral. "Are you threatening me, Officer Jenkins?" "Just stating facts, Monroe. Sometimes inmates fall downstairs. Sometimes they choke on their food. Sometimes dash." The sharp ring of Santos's phone cut through the diner's quiet atmosphere. Noah Fields' name flashed on the screen. "Judge!" Fields' voice was breathless, excited. "I found her. Maria Delgado. She was Angela's neighbor. She can prove Angela was home the entire night of the murder, but someone paid her to leave town before the trial." "Where are you?" Santos asked, already standing up. "2 blocks from—" There was a sudden crash, followed by the sound of breaking glass. "Oh God, no!" "Noah! Noah!" Santos shouted into the phone. The line went dead. Parker stared at Santos with wide eyes. "What just happened?" "They got to him," Santos said, his voice hollow. "They got to Noah before he could bring in the witness." Judge Daniel Santos raced through the darkened streets, his heart pounding. He found Noah Fields slumped against a brick wall in an alley, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. They tried to grab the files. Noah mumbled as Santos helped him up. "But I managed to hold on to them." He patted his jacket pocket weakly. Inside Noah's car, under the dim overhead light, they examined the documents together. Santos's hands trembled as he read through statement after statement. Witnesses who had been threatened, families who had been intimidated. "Look at this." Noah pointed to a highlighted section. 3 key witnesses changed their stories on the same day. All of them mentioned visits from unnamed officials. Detective Carla Reyes called while they were still reviewing the papers. "Judge, I found Valerie Green," she said, her voice urgent. "She's been hiding in a small town upstate. She's terrified, but she's finally ready to talk." "What made her change her mind?" Santos asked. "Guilt," Reyes replied. "She says she can't live with herself anymore, knowing an innocent woman might die because she was too scared to tell the truth." With mounting evidence in hand, Santos drove to Judge Harold Whitmore's elegant suburban home. The porch lights cast long shadows across the manicured lawn as Whitmore opened the door, still in his court clothes. "Daniel, what brings you here at this hour?" Santos held up the files. "I know what you did, Harold. The witness tampering, the jury selection, all of it. You made sure Angela Monroe would be convicted." Whitmore's friendly expression didn't waver. He simply opened the door wider and gestured Santos inside. In his wood-paneled study, Whitmore poured himself a drink, his movements deliberate and calm. "You know, Daniel," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "I've always admired your dedication to justice. But sometimes justice isn't what's best for everyone." "You're admitting to it?" Santos asked, incredulous. "I'm telling you to be smart," Whitmore replied, his voice taking on a sharp edge. "You have a beautiful career, a sterling reputation. Think about your family, your future. All of that can disappear very quickly." He set down his glass and leaned forward. "Walk away from this, Daniel. Because if you don't, you'll lose everything. And that's not a threat. It's a guarantee." Santos stared at his longtime colleague, seeing him clearly for the first time. "Are you actually threatening me, Harold?" "Threatening?" Whitmore smiled coldly. "No, I'm trying to save you from yourself. But if you insist on pursuing this foolishness, well..." He shrugged. "Actions have consequences, Daniel. very permanent ones. Judge Daniel Santos sat in his dimly lit study, surrounded by stacks of damning evidence. His hands shook as he dialed Detective Carla Reyes's number. "We can't wait for the system," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "They'll bury this evidence before we can use it legally." "I agree," Reyes replied. "Noah's already compiled a detailed report for the press." Noah Fields had spent sleepless nights organizing the documents, creating a clear timeline of corruption that even a child could understand. His investigative skills as a journalist were finally being put to their best use. Meanwhile, in the cold confines of her prison cell, Angela Monroe watched as guards approached with transfer papers. Her heart sank as she realized what was happening. "Maximum security facility," one guard announced gruffly. "Pack up." Angela knew what this meant. They were trying to silence her, cut her off from the outside world. As she gathered her few belongings, she whispered a prayer that Santos and the others would act quickly enough. That evening, Noah Fields met with trusted reporters from 3 major newspapers in a quiet coffee shop. His hands trembled as he handed over thick folders of evidence. "The biggest story isn't just about Angela Monroe's wrongful conviction," he explained. "It's about who really killed Thomas Chen." The reporters leafed through the documents, their eyes widening. There, in black and white, was a trail of money leading directly to Victor Halloway, CEO of Halloway Industries. Bank statements showed massive payments to Judge Harold Whitmore's offshore accounts. Phone records revealed calls between Halloway and Chen on the night of the murder. Halloway was funding a network of corrupt officials, Detective Reyes explained, joining the meeting. Chen threatened to expose everything. When Angela started investigating the corruption independently, they framed her for Chen's murder. Judge Santos added his own testimony, describing how Judge Whitmore had manipulated the trial from the beginning. His voice cracked as he spoke about his unwitting role in condemning an innocent woman. "This isn't just about clearing Angela Monroe," Santos said, looking each reporter in the eye. "This is about exposing a cancer in our justice system." As they spoke, Angela was being transported to her new prison, watching the city lights fade away through the small window of the transfer van. She didn't know that at that very moment, the truth about Victor Halloway was finally coming to light. The reporters asked careful questions, documenting everything. They knew this story would shake the city to its core. A prominent businessman murdering to protect his corrupt empire, a judge accepting bribes, and an innocent prosecutor framed to keep her quiet. It was the story of the decade. Judge Daniel Santos paced in his chambers, his face drawn with worry as he reviewed the emergency appeal documents one more time. The Supreme Court clerk on the phone had been maddeningly vague about when they would review the case. "I understand the urgency, Your Honor," the clerk said, "but there are procedures that must be followed." Santos slammed down the phone, knowing these procedures were just another delay tactic. His hands trembled as he looked at the calendar on his desk. Angela Monroe's execution was scheduled for next Wednesday. In her maximum security cell, Angela sat on her narrow bed, writing letters to the few people who had stood by her. Her hand was steady, her words careful and measured. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. "I want you to know that whatever happens," she wrote to her elderly mother, "I face this with dignity. The truth matters more than my life." A guard approached her cell. "Time for exercise, Monroe." Angela carefully folded the letter and stood up, her head held high. She wouldn't let fear show on her face, even as the days grew shorter. Back at the courthouse, Judge Santos was preparing to leave when a note appeared under his door. "Parking garage, level B2, 8 p.m. Come alone." Santos recognized the handwriting. It matched the anonymous tips he'd been receiving. His heart pounded as he waited in the dim parking garage later that evening. Footsteps echoed through the concrete structure. "Your Honor," a familiar voice called out. Santos turned to see Michael Travers, a senior clerk he'd worked with for years, stepping out of the shadows. The man looked nervous, but determined. "It was you all along?" Santos asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Travers nodded, pulling out a USB drive from his pocket. I've been collecting evidence for years. Electronic copies of lost documents, recorded conversations, financial records that were supposed to be destroyed. His hands shook slightly. I couldn't come forward earlier. They were watching too closely. But now... Why didn't you tell me sooner? Santos asked, his voice cracking with emotion. I needed to be sure you were really looking for the truth, Travers replied, his eyes meeting Santos's. I've watched too many good people get corrupted. But you risked everything to find the truth. Travers handed over the USB drive. This is everything they tried to bury. Audio recordings of Judge Whitmore discussing the frame-up with Holloway. Proof that evidence was deliberately withheld from Angela's defense. Bank records showing payoffs to Supreme Court officials who are now delaying your appeal. Santos stared at the small device in his hand, realizing it contained enough evidence to blow the entire conspiracy wide open. This could save her life, he whispered. It will, Travers said firmly. But we need to move fast. They're already suspicious of me. Judge Daniel Santos sat at his desk when his phone buzzed. The message made his blood run cold. Angela Monroe's execution had been scheduled for 10 days from now. His hands trembled as he set the phone down, knowing this was no coincidence. They were accelerating the timeline. Your Honor, Michael Travers knocked softly before entering the office. His face was pale, and he carried a thick manila envelope. I have more. Santos gestured for him to close the door. Travers pulled out stacks of internal memos and email printouts, spreading them across the desk. Look at this one. Travers pointed to a highlighted section. Email from Judge Whitmore to the evidence clerk, ordering certain files to be misplaced before the trial. Santos read through the documents, his stomach churning. There were dozens of communications, each one revealing how methodically they had destroyed Angela's chance at a fair trial. This proves everything, Santos whispered, his voice hoarse. The evidence tampering, the witness intimidation. He picked up another memo. They even doctored the forensic reports. There's more, Travers said quietly. They specifically targeted pieces of evidence that would have supported her alibi. Santos gathered the documents carefully, placing them in his briefcase. I need to get these somewhere safe tonight. First thing tomorrow, we'll... Be careful, Travers interrupted, his eyes worried. They're watching all of us now. Later that night, Santos pulled into his driveway, clutching his briefcase close. The house was dark, exactly as he'd left it. But something felt wrong. The moment he opened his front door, he knew. Papers were strewn everywhere. Drawers hung open, their contents dumped onto the floor. His office had been completely ransacked. His heart pounding, Santos moved through the chaos. Every case file, every document related to Angela's case, gone. Even his backup files were missing from their hiding place behind the bookshelf. Then he saw it. On his desk, placed precisely in the center, was a single white note card. His hands shook as he picked it up, reading the typed message. Drop it, or she dies sooner. Santos sank into his chair, the weight of the threat crushing down on him. They had been in his house. They knew where he lived, what he was doing, probably even about Travers and the new evidence. He pulled out his phone to call the police, then stopped. Who could he trust? The corruption clearly reached deep into law enforcement. The wrong call now could sign both his and Angela's death warrants. In her cell, Angela sat writing in her journal, unaware that her already numbered days had just been reduced. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she wrote about still believing in justice, even now. Santos stared at the threatening note, his mind racing. 10 days. They had 10 days to save an innocent woman's life, and now the stakes were even higher. But with all his evidence gone, where could he even begin? Judge Harold Whitmore stood at the podium, his face a mask of righteous indignation as cameras flashed. "It pains me to see a respected colleague fall so far," he announced to the gathered reporters. "Judge Santos has clearly lost his objectivity and is undermining our justice system." The morning news showed Whitmore's face everywhere, alongside headlines like "Disgraced Judge Attempts to Derail Justice" and "Santos from Upholder to Underminer of Law." Victor Holloway's media connections were working overtime, painting Santos as a conspiracy theorist who had lost his way. Santos watched the coverage from his living room, his coffee growing cold in his hands. His phone hadn't stopped ringing with calls from other judges and lawyers, some expressing concern about his mental state, others distancing themselves completely. "They're trying to discredit you before you can expose them," Noah Fields said, pacing Santos's living room. "But I've got them. My article lays out everything: the tampered evidence, the witness intimidation, the financial connections between Holloway and the court officials." Fields's article was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, methodically dismantling the case against Angela Monroe. But just hours before publication, his editor called him into the office. "We can't run it," the editor said, avoiding Fields's eyes. "The legal department says it's too risky. We could face multiple lawsuits." "They got to you, didn't they?" Fields demanded, but his editor just shuffled papers, refusing to respond. Meanwhile, Detective Carla Reyes was escorting Valerie Green to a safe house. Green clutched her bag nervously, glancing over her shoulder. "I should have come forward sooner," she whispered. "I saw Angela that night. She couldn't have committed that murder." They were 3 blocks from the safe house when it happened. A black SUV cut them off. Before Reyes could react, armed men in masks surrounded their car. "No!" Reyes reached for her weapon, but a taser hit her first. Through blurring vision, she watched helplessly as they dragged Green from the car. When Santos received the news of Green's kidnapping, he slumped in his chair, the weight of failure crushing him. Their last chance at solid testimony had vanished into thin air. "They're always one step ahead," he muttered, staring at Whitmore's face on the TV screen. His old friend was now calling for an ethics investigation into Santos's behavior. Fields burst into Santos's office, his face flushed with anger. "They killed my story, but I'm not done. I'll post it online, reach out to other outlets." "They'll destroy you too," Santos said quietly. "Look what they did to Green. Look what they're doing to me." But Fields shook his head stubbornly. "We can't let them win. There has to be another way." In her dimly lit prison cell, Angela Monroe sat at the small metal desk, her hand steady as she wrote. The guards had granted her this one small mercy, paper and pen to write what might be her final words. Her letter to Judge Santos flowed from her heart. "Dear Judge Santos, I see now what this fight has cost you. Your reputation, your safety, perhaps even your faith in the system you served so faithfully. But know this: whatever happens to me, your courage in seeking the truth has already restored my faith in justice. Make peace with your conscience, no matter the outcome. Some battles are worth fighting, even if we lose. Sincerely, Angela Monroe." Meanwhile, Detective Carla Reyes hunched over her computer, her eyes red from hours of searching. The tracking data from Green's phone had finally yielded results. A ping from an industrial area just outside the city limits. "Got you," she whispered, zooming in on the map. The location was an abandoned warehouse complex, once used for storing construction materials. She reached for her phone to call Santos, but it went straight to voicemail. What she didn't know was that Santos had already received a text message with the same location, along with a warning: "Come alone, or she dies. No police." Santos parked his car a block away from the warehouse, his hands trembling slightly as he turned off the engine. The street was deserted, broken glass crunching under his feet as he walked. The setting sun cast long shadows between the abandoned buildings. He knew it was foolish to come alone, reckless even. But after Green's kidnapping and the systematic dismantling of their case, he couldn't risk another person getting hurt because of his actions. The warehouse loomed before him, its rusty doors hanging partially open. A voice called from inside. "That's far enough, Judge." Santos stopped, his heart pounding. "I'm here alone, just like you asked. Where is Valerie Green?" A figure emerged from the shadows, then another. Both wore masks. Behind them, he could see Green tied to a chair, her eyes wide with fear but very much alive. "You've caused a lot of trouble, Judge," one of the men said, his voice muffled by the mask. "But we're willing to make a deal." Santos stood his ground, though every instinct screamed at him to run. "I'm listening," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. The masked man stepped closer to Santos, his voice cold and calculating. "Here's the deal, Judge. Walk away now, forget about Monroe's case, and you get to keep your life. Green goes free too. Everyone wins." Santos's jaw tightened. "And if I refuse? Then you'll join Monroe on death row, though your end might come much sooner." The second kidnapper pressed a gun against Green's temple, making her whimper. Santos felt sick to his stomach. All those years on the bench, passing judgment on others, and now he faced the ultimate moral choice himself. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "You're asking me to let an innocent woman die." "We're asking you to be smart," the first man said. "Think about your family, Judge. Your career. Is Monroe really worth throwing it all away?" Before Santos could respond, a voice boomed through a megaphone from outside. "This is Detective Reyes. The building is surrounded. Come out with your hands up." Bright spotlights suddenly flooded through the warehouse windows. The kidnappers spun around, momentarily blinded. In that split second, Green threw herself sideways, chair and all, knocking into her guard's legs. "SWAT team, move in," Reyes's voice commanded. The warehouse erupted into chaos. The first kidnapper bolted toward a back exit. The second one raised his gun, but before he could fire, SWAT officers burst through multiple entrances, their laser sights creating a web of red dots across the warehouse floor. "Drop your weapon," an officer shouted. The second kidnapper hesitated, then let his gun clatter to the ground. But in the confusion, his partner had vanished through a hidden door in the back. Santos rushed to Green, helping her up as officers secured the scene. She was shaking but unhurt. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'll testify. About everything." Detective Reyes strode in, her badge gleaming under the spotlights. "Judge, what were you thinking coming here alone?" Her voice was sharp with concern. "How did you find us?" Santos asked. "Phone tracking," she said, holstering her weapon. "And next time, don't turn off your phone's GPS. We almost lost you." She turned to the captured kidnapper. "Get him out of here and seal off the perimeter. His partner couldn't have gone far." But they all knew the truth. One kidnapper had escaped, taking with him the direct link to Victor Holloway. The rescued witness and captured kidnapper would help their case, but the mastermind was still pulling strings from the shadows. Judge Daniel Santos sat in his office, surrounded by stacks of legal documents as he and his team worked frantically to prepare the emergency appeal. Michael Travers, the courthouse whistleblower, handed him another folder filled with damning evidence. "These internal memos prove the evidence tampering," Travers said, his voice tight with urgency. "And Ms. Green's testimony about witnessing Monroe elsewhere during the murder should be impossible to ignore." Santos nodded, dark circles under his eyes from sleepless nights. But will it be enough? In her isolation cell, Angela Monroe paced the small space, her footsteps echoing off concrete walls. The guards had strict orders: no visitors, no phone calls, no contact with her legal team. She pressed her hands against the cold wall, fighting back tears of frustration. At the Supreme Court, Judge Harold Whitmore moved through the marble halls with practiced ease, stopping to chat with his old colleagues. His smile was pleasant, but his words carried weight. "The Monroe case is clear-cut," he told them over coffee. "Reviewing it would only waste the court's valuable time. Besides, the evidence was thoroughly examined during the original trial." But later that afternoon, as Santos was reviewing the appeal one final time, his office phone rang. The voice on the other end was hushed, careful. "Judge Santos? This is Justice Rebecca Martinez. I can't talk long." She paused. "Whitmore's been lobbying hard against your appeal. But there's another way. File a writ of habeas corpus, citing newly discovered evidence. Focus on constitutional violations during the original trial." Santos's hand tightened on the receiver. "Why are you helping us?" "Because I've seen this before," Martinez whispered. "Good prosecutors destroyed by the system when they get too close to the truth. Monroe's case isn't the first." The line went dead. Santos immediately called his team back to the office. They worked through the night, reframing their appeal around the constitutional violations. Valerie Green's testimony about seeing Monroe across town during the murder was now supported by security camera footage that Travers had uncovered. Footage that had mysteriously vanished during the original trial. "We need to file this first thing tomorrow," Santos told his exhausted team, "before Whitmore can—" A commotion in the hallway cut him off. Judge Harold Whitmore burst into the office, his face flushed with anger. "You're making a mistake, Daniel," he said, his voice dangerously low. "This appeal will destroy everything we've built. The system works because people like us protect it." Santos stood slowly, meeting his former friend's gaze. "No, Harold. The system works when we protect the truth." Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "Then you leave me no choice." He pulled an envelope from his jacket and tossed it on the desk. "Those are photos of your daughter's apartment building. Nice place. Would be a shame if something happened to it." The clock on the prison wall showed 10:15 p.m. Angela Monroe sat in her cell, her hands folded calmly in her lap despite the terror churning inside her. The guards would come for her soon. Across town, Judge Daniel Santos paced in his office while Noah Fields and Detective Carla Reyes worked their phones frantically. They had traced the escaped kidnapper to a motel on the outskirts of town. "He's there," Reyes said, hanging up her phone. "My contact saw him check in an hour ago. Room 114. Santos grabbed his coat. "Let's go. We have less than 2 hours." At the motel, they found the kidnapper, a nervous man named Frank Dawson, trying to slip out the back door. Reyes tackled him before he could run. "You're going to tell us everything," she growled, pressing him against the wall. "About Holloway, about the frame-up, all of it." Dawson broke easily, sobbing out a confession while Fields recorded every word. He admitted to planting evidence, threatening witnesses, all under Holloway's orders. At 11:15 p.m., Santos burst into the Supreme Court clerk's office with the recorded confession. "Please," he begged, "you have to get this to them. An innocent woman's life depends on it." Inside the chamber, Angela changed into the clothes they'd given her for the execution. Her hands trembled slightly as she buttoned the shirt, but her face remained composed. A guard watched through the small window. At 11:45 p.m., the Supreme Court's decision came down. Santos read it with disbelieving eyes. "Appeal denied. Stay of execution rejected." "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." In the execution chamber, Angela walked with dignity between two guards. They strapped her to the gurney while a small group of witnesses watched through glass. Her voice was steady as she spoke her final words. "The truth will come out," she said, "and when it does, remember that I forgave you all." The clock struck 11:55 p.m. The prison chaplain began to pray. Outside the prison walls, Santos, Fields, and Reyes rushed through security, desperately waving documents and shouting for someone to listen. But the guards wouldn't let them through. Time was running out. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as Angela Monroe walked down the long corridor, her chains rattling with each measured step. The guards flanked her closely, their faces grim and purposefully blank. Despite the weight of the shackles, she held her head high. The warden stood at the entrance to the execution chamber, a piece of paper trembling slightly in his weathered hands. His voice echoed off the sterile walls as he read out the charges. Angela Monroe, you have been found guilty of first-degree murder. Angela's face remained composed, though her heart pounded against her ribs. After everything, after all the fighting, it seemed this would be how her story ended. She thought of Judge Santos and the others who had tried so hard to save her. At least someone had finally believed in her innocence. The sound of shouting echoed from somewhere in the facility. Judge Daniel Santos's voice boomed through the corridors, growing closer. "This is Judge Daniel Santos. You have to stop this. We have new evidence." Two guards blocked his path as he reached the security checkpoint, his tie askew and face flushed with desperation. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," one guard said firmly. "Without an official stay of execution, we can't halt the procedure." "Please," Santos pleaded, his usual judicial composure cracking. "You're about to kill an innocent woman." Inside the chamber, the medical team guided Angela onto the table. The leather straps felt cold against her skin as they secured her arms and legs. The witnesses watched through the glass partition, their faces blurring together in Angela's vision. The prison chaplain approached, his Bible clutched to his chest. He leaned down as if to offer a final prayer, but instead pressed a small folded note into her palm. "Hold on," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's not over." Angela's fingers closed around the paper, her heart skipping a beat. The chaplain's eyes held something she hadn't seen in weeks: hope. Through the glass, she could still hear Judge Santos arguing with the guards, his voice growing hoarse with desperation. The warden checked his watch, then nodded to the medical team. They began preparing the fourth line while Angela lay there, the chaplain's note burning in her palm like a tiny flame of hope in the darkness. Noah Fields and Detective Carla Reyes found Daryl Quinn hiding in a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. The hitman's room smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap whiskey. Quinn sat handcuffed to a metal chair, his face bruised from an earlier scuffle with Victor Holloway's men. "They'll kill me if I talk," Quinn muttered, his eyes darting between Noah and Carla. "Someone's going to die tonight either way," Carla said, her voice hard as steel. "An innocent woman. Unless you help us stop it." Noah paced the small room, checking his watch every few seconds. "We don't have time for games, Quinn. Tell us what really happened." Quinn's shoulders slumped. Holloway wanted Monroe dead. She was getting too close to exposing his operation, but the hit went wrong. He swallowed hard. "We got the wrong person. Some businessman who looked like Monroe's informant." "And Judge Whitmore?" Carla pressed. "Whitmore made it all go away. Fixed the evidence, threatened witnesses, made sure Monroe took the fall." Quinn's hands trembled. "He orchestrated everything. The trial was rigged from the start." Noah's heart raced. "We need proof, something concrete." Quinn hesitated, then nodded toward his duffel bag in the corner. "There's a flash drive in the side pocket. I always keep insurance. There's a recording of the actual murder. Shows everything." Carla retrieved the flash drive while Noah kept his eyes locked on Quinn. They plugged it into Noah's laptop, and grainy security footage filled the screen. The timestamp matched the night of the murder. The video clearly showed Quinn and another man carrying out the hit, while Angela Monroe was miles away at a charity event. "This is it," Noah whispered, his hands shaking as he copied the file. "This proves she's innocent." Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed from the walkway outside. Through the thin curtains, they could see the silhouettes of multiple armed men, Holloway's cleanup crew. "They found me," Quinn whispered, terror creeping into his voice. Noah Fields' hands trembled as he uploaded the security footage to his newspaper's secure server. His editor's face appeared on the video call, eyes widening as he watched the damning evidence. "This changes everything," the editor said. "We're going live in 5 minutes." Meanwhile, Judge Daniel Santos burst into his chambers, his tie loose and sweat beading on his forehead. His clerk rushed to type up the emergency injunction as he dictated. "Get this to the warden immediately," Santos ordered, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "We have proof of her innocence." At the prison, the warden stood in his office, phone pressed to his ear. His face remained stone cold as he listened to Judge Santos's demands. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," the warden said flatly. "Without direct authorization from the governor, I cannot halt this execution." Detective Carla Reyes paced outside the governor's mansion, desperately trying to reach her cousin. "Come on, Michael, pick up," she muttered. When he finally answered, his voice was unnaturally formal. "Carla, I can't help you with this." "Michael, we have proof. She's innocent." Carla's voice cracked. "You have to stop this." There was a long pause. "I'm blocking all calls regarding the Monroe case," Governor Reyes said coldly. "This execution will proceed as scheduled." Carla felt the blood drain from her face as realization hit her. "You knew," she whispered. "You've known all along." "Go home, Carla," the governor said. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The line went dead. Carla's hand shook as she dialed Judge Santos's number. "It's worse than we thought," she said, her voice trembling. "The governor, he's part of it. He's blocking everything." On the television screens across the city, Noah's story began to break. The security footage played on repeat, showing the real murderers clear as day. But in the execution chamber, the clock continued its merciless countdown, and the warden stood firm, deliberately ignoring the phones that rang incessantly in his office. Judge Santos slammed his fist against his desk, watching helplessly as his legal authority crumbled against the wall of corruption that reached all the way to the governor's mansion. The justice system he had devoted his life to was rotting from the inside out, and an innocent woman was about to pay the ultimate price. The execution chamber's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as Judge Daniel Santos burst through the door, his usually dignified demeanor replaced by desperate determination. "Stop this immediately," he shouted, pushing past the stunned guards. Without hesitation, he positioned himself between Angela Monroe and the executioner, his arms spread wide. "You'll have to go through me first." Angela's eyes widened, tears streaming down her face as she watched her former judge now become her human shield. The guards moved to grab Santos, their hands reaching for his shoulders. "Sir, you need to step away," one guard warned, his voice stern but uncertain. "I will not move," Santos declared, his voice trembling but resolute. "This woman is innocent, and I will not let another injustice happen in the name of the law." The executioner stood frozen, syringe in hand, looking desperately at the warden for direction. The tension in the room was suffocating. Suddenly, the warden's phone rang. The shrill sound cut through the silence like a knife. His face drained of color as he listened to the voice on the other end. "Yes, Your Honor," the warden said, his voice suddenly small. "I understand. Yes, immediately." He lowered the phone, looking both relieved and worried. That was Justice Eleanor Martinez. The Supreme Court has granted an emergency stay of execution. The room collectively exhaled. Santos's shoulders slumped with relief as the guards began unstrapping Angela from the table. She was shaking, barely able to stand as they helped her up. "Thank you," she whispered to Santos, her voice raw with emotion. "You risked everything." "Back to your cell, Monroe," the warden ordered, but his authoritative tone had lost its edge. "You're still legally condemned until this case is overturned." As Angela was led away, Santos's phone buzzed. It was Noah Fields. The journalist's voice was electric with excitement. "Judge, turn on any news channel right now," Noah said. "The story just broke. We have Governor Reyes on tape from 3 years ago, signing off on fabricated evidence against Angela. He personally approved false witness statements and doctored financial records. The whole thing's falling apart." Santos watched as Angela disappeared down the corridor, knowing that while she was alive, she wasn't yet free. The corrupt system that had nearly taken her life was still in place, even as its architects were being exposed. Governor Michael Reyes's face appeared on the small TV mounted in the prison's security office, his previous confidence now replaced by barely concealed panic, as reporters swarmed him outside the state capitol. "No comment," the governor repeated, pushing through the crowd of journalists, but his guilty expression said everything his. The morning after the failed execution, Victor Holloway paced in his penthouse office, his perfectly tailored suit, doing little to hide the tension in his shoulders. His phone buzzed with desperate messages from his associates, each one bringing worse news than the last. "Take care of Santos," he barked into his phone. "He's become too much of a liability." Across town, Noah Fields sat in a brightly lit television studio, adjusting his tie as the makeup artist made final touches. The live light blinked red, and the anchor turned to him. "Mr. Fields, you claim to have evidence of corruption reaching the highest levels of our state government. What can you tell us?" Noah's voice was steady as he held up a thick folder. "I have here documented proof of systematic corruption involving Governor Michael Reyes, businessman Victor Holloway, and several high-ranking judges. This includes signed orders, bank transfers, and recorded conversations." As Noah spoke, Detective Carla Reyes and her team were coordinating with airport security. They had received a tip that Judge Harold Whitmore was attempting to flee the country. Judge Daniel Santos was leaving the courthouse when he noticed a black SUV following him. His heart raced as he remembered Victor Holloway's reputation for silencing threats. He quickly ducked into a crowded coffee shop, pulling out his phone to call Detective Reyes. At the airport, Judge Harold Whitmore tried to maintain his dignified appearance as he hurried toward the private aviation terminal. His hands trembled as he clutched a briefcase containing offshore account numbers and a fake passport. "Going somewhere, Your Honor." Detective Reyes's voice cut through the terminal's ambient noise. Whitmore turned to find himself surrounded by officers. "This is a mistake," Whitmore stammered, his usual authority crumbling. "I have diplomatic immunity." "Not anymore," Detective Reyes said, nodding to her officers. As they cuffed him, Whitmore's briefcase fell open, spilling its incriminating contents across the floor. Back at the television studio, Noah Fields was delivering the final blow. "And here's the recording of Victor Holloway himself ordering the murder that Angela Monroe was framed for." He played the audio, watching as the anchor's eyes widened in shock. The hitmen tracking Judge Santos received urgent calls from their employer. Victor Holloway's voice was panicked. "Abort the hit. I repeat, abort. It's too late. They have everything." Judge Harold Whitmore sat in the interrogation room, his expensive suit now wrinkled, his face haggard. Detective Carla Reyes placed a legal pad in front of him as his lawyer whispered in his ear. "I'll tell you everything," Whitmore said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I want protection. Holloway has people everywhere." Over the next 3 hours, Whitmore detailed the entire conspiracy. How they'd fabricated evidence against Angela Monroe, how they'd threatened witnesses, how Victor Holloway had orchestrated everything, using money and fear to corrupt the justice system. The next morning, Angela Monroe stood in her prison cell as the warden approached with official papers. Her hands shook as she read the words, "Full exoneration." "You're free to go, Ms. Monroe," the warden said quietly. Angela walked through the prison gates, squinting in the bright sunlight. Judge Daniel Santos and Noah Fields waited for her, along with Detective Reyes. Tears streamed down Angela's face as she took her first free steps in years. "I never lost faith," she said, hugging each of them. Even when they strapped me to that table, I knew the truth would come out. But their celebration was cut short by Detective Reyes's phone ringing. Her face turned grave as she listened. "Victor Holloway was just found dead in his penthouse," she announced. "Initial reports say suicide, gunshot wound to the head. Note on his desk confessing to everything." Judge Santos frowned. "Suicide? That doesn't sound like Holloway." "The note was typed, not handwritten," Detective Reyes added, her eyes narrowing. "And the security cameras in his building mysteriously malfunctioned an hour before his death." Angela looked at the detective. "Someone's tying up loose ends." Noah Fields pulled out his reporter's notebook. "The question is, who had the most to lose if Holloway started talking?" The prison gates creaked open under the bright morning sun. Angela Monroe stepped through them, her few belongings clutched in a small paper bag. The roar of the waiting crowd hit her like a wave. Supporters holding signs, reporters with microphones thrust forward, and familiar faces she hadn't seen in years. "Ms. Monroe, how does it feel to be free?" a reporter called out. Angela blinked, still adjusting to life without bars and guards. Detective Carla Reyes stepped forward protectively, shielding her from the press crush. Noah Fields stood nearby, not as a reporter this time, but as a friend who had helped save her life. Judge Daniel Santos waited at the edge of the crowd, looking smaller somehow without his judicial robes. Earlier that morning, he had submitted his resignation from the bench. His reputation was in tatters, his career over. But there was a peace in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "I'm sorry," he said quietly when Angela reached him. "I failed you as a judge." "You made it right in the end," she replied simply. Detective Reyes and Noah Fields were practically glowing with triumph. Noah had already won several journalism awards for exposing the corruption. Carla had been promoted to lead investigator. They chatted excitedly about celebration plans, about justice served, about the future. But Angela remained quiet, her eyes distant. These people had given her back her freedom, but they couldn't return the years she'd lost. The birthdays, holidays, and simple everyday moments that had been stolen while she sat in a concrete cell, waiting to die. In the midst of the chaos, something caught her attention. A woman she didn't recognize stood apart from the crowd, watching her intently. Their eyes met for just a moment before the stranger turned and disappeared into the sea of faces. "Angela, are you okay?" Detective Reyes asked, noticing her distraction. "Yes," Angela said slowly, still staring at the spot where the woman had been. "I'm just taking it all in." The cameras continued to flash around her as she took her first steps as a free woman, each one carrying the weight of everything she had endured to reach this moment. Judge Daniel Santos placed his law books into a cardboard box, each thud echoing in the empty office. Through the glass walls, he could see his former colleagues hurrying past, averting their eyes. Some of these people had been his friends for decades. Now, they treated him like he carried a contagious disease. His hands trembled as he picked up the photo of his swearing-in ceremony. 20 years of service ended in disgrace. The golden nameplate on his desk, Honorable Daniel Santos, seemed to mock him now. A soft knock at the door made him look up. Angela Monroe stood there, her presence both unexpected and unsettling. His heart clenched with shame as he remembered pronouncing her death sentence. "Ms. Monroe," he said quietly, his voice rough. "I didn't expect to see you here." She stepped into the office, her eyes taking in the half-packed boxes. Neither did I, to be honest. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words. Judge Santos couldn't meet her eyes. "I deserve your hatred," he finally said. "Hatred?" Angela's voice was steady. "I had enough of that in prison. It doesn't serve any purpose." She picked up his gavel, turning it over in her hands. "You were part of the system that tried to destroy me, but you also fought to save me. Make that count." Before Santos could respond, a woman appeared in the doorway, the same mysterious figure who had watched Angela's release. She carried herself with quiet authority, her accent distinctly European. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but there's something you both need to know." She pulled out a press badge from her bag. "I'm Isabella Kovac, investigative journalist from the European Times. Victor Holloway didn't commit suicide. I have proof he was murdered." Santos and Angela exchanged shocked looks. The system they'd fought against wasn't finished with them yet. Angela Monroe sat in the sleek conference room of Wilson & Partners, one of the country's top civil rights law firms. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished table. "We need voices like yours, Ms. Monroe," said Sarah Wilson, the firm's lead attorney. Her eyes were kind but determined. "Someone who's lived through the system's failures and emerged stronger." Angela's fingers traced the rim of her water glass. "I'm not sure I'm ready to relive it all again." "Your story could change lives," another attorney added. "Think of all the innocent people still behind bars." The weight of responsibility pressed down on Angela's shoulders. She thought of the women she'd left behind in prison, some possibly as innocent as she had been. Across town, Noah Field sat in his publisher's office, holding the first copy of his book, Justice Denied: The Angela Monroe Story. The cover showed courthouse steps in stark black and white. "Pre-orders are through the roof," his publisher said excitedly. "People want to know how deep this corruption went." Meanwhile, Judge Daniel Santos walked through the quiet halls of City Law School. His footsteps echoed against the marble floors as he approached the dean's office. His application for a teaching position felt like a shot at redemption. "Your experience," the dean said, reviewing his file, "though controversial, could be invaluable to our students, teaching them about judicial bias and its consequences." Before Santos could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from Angela. She was meeting with Isabella Kovac, the European journalist, at a nearby cafe. When he arrived, Angela sat rigid in her chair, staring at an open envelope. Isabella Kovac watched her carefully. "What is it?" Santos asked, sitting down. Angela's hands shook as she pulled out several photographs. "The conspiracy," she whispered. "It wasn't just about one corrupt businessman or a few dirty judges." She spread the photos across the table, surveillance images of powerful figures, bank statements, encrypted emails. "It's still happening." Isabella Kovac leaned forward. "What you exposed was just one branch of a much larger tree. And now that you've cut off that branch..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. The implications were clear in the evidence before them. Angela looked up at Santos, her face set with determination. Suddenly, her decision about becoming an advocate for legal reform didn't seem like a choice anymore. It was a necessity. Angela's hands trembled as she flipped through Isabella Kovac's detailed report. Each page revealed another innocent person behind bars, their lives destroyed by the same corrupt machine that had nearly killed her. Names of judges, politicians, and business leaders jumped out from the pages, people still walking free, still wielding power. "These cases span 3 states, Isabella explained, her accent thick with concern. "Same pattern every time. Anyone who threatened to expose the network was silenced." Detective Carla Reyes paced behind them, her face tight with worry. "Angela, these people, they're not just corrupt officials. They're dangerous. Some of them make Victor Holloway look like a small-time crook." Angela set down the report, her jaw clenched. "So we're supposed to just let them continue destroying lives?" "We're supposed to be smart about this," Carla replied softly. "They're watching you now more than ever." Across town, Judge Daniel Santos sat in his study, reading the formal letter from the Supreme Court for the 10th time. The words were polite, but final. His career as a judge was over. The letter acknowledged his role in exposing the corruption, but stated clearly that his initial failure to recognize the flaws in Angela's case made him unfit to return to the bench. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. Strange how the words that ended his career brought him a sense of peace. He had failed once, but he'd fought to make it right. Maybe that was enough. The night grew cold as Angela left her temporary apartment for a late-night walk. The streets were quiet, save for the distant sound of traffic. She needed air, space to think about what to do with Isabella's evidence. The first time she noticed the black sedan, it was 3 blocks behind her. By the 4th block, it had gotten closer. The engine purred quietly, headlights dim, maintaining a steady distance. Angela's heart pounded as she took a sharp turn down a side street. The car followed. She quickened her pace, her shoes clicking against the pavement. The car accelerated slightly. She fumbled for her phone, dialing Carla's number with shaking fingers. The black sedan was getting closer now, close enough that she could hear the soft squeal of its tires as it turned each corner after her. "Carla," she whispered into the phone, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm being followed. Black sedan, tinted windows, no plates." She ducked into an alley, hoping to lose them, but the car's headlights swept across the entrance, casting long shadows ahead of her. Angela sat across from Isabella Kovac in a quiet corner of a dimly lit cafe. Steam rose from their untouched coffee cups as the journalist spread out documents across the small table. "Victor Halloway was just the tip of the iceberg," Isabella explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a network of judges, politicians, business leaders, all working together to protect their interests." Angela's fingers traced the edge of a photograph showing several prominent figures at a private gathering. How many innocent people have they put away? Dozens, maybe hundreds. Isabella pulled out more files. They've been operating for at least 15 years. Anyone who threatens their operation ends up dead or behind bars. Noah Fields arrived, sliding into the seat beside them. His usual energetic demeanor was replaced with a serious expression. "I've secured a primetime slot. Tomorrow night, live interview. The whole country will hear your story." Angela nodded slowly, but before she could respond, Judge Daniel Santos appeared at their table. His face was drawn with concern, his voice urgent but gentle. "Angela, please think carefully about this," he said, pulling up a chair. "These people, they're more dangerous than you know. They have connections everywhere." "I can't stay silent," Angela replied firmly. "Not when I know others are suffering like I did." "They'll come for you," Santos warned, his eyes filled with genuine fear. "They won't just threaten. They'll act." Noah leaned forward. "We can protect her. I have security arranged, safe houses ready." "You don't understand," Santos interrupted. "They have people everywhere. Police, private security, government agencies." Angela stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I didn't survive death row just to live in fear. These people need to be exposed." Later that evening, Angela returned to her temporary apartment. The moment she opened the door, she knew something was wrong. Papers were strewn across the floor, furniture overturned, drawers emptied. Her heart pounding, she moved through the ransacked rooms. On her bedroom mirror, written in red lipstick, was a chilling message. "Stay silent, or you'll disappear next." Her hands shaking, she called Noah. "They were here," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her fear. "They left a message." "I'm sending security right now," Noah replied urgently. "Don't touch anything. Don't leave." Angela stood in the middle of her destroyed living room, surrounded by the chaos. Photos of her family were torn, personal documents scattered, but Isabella's files, safely hidden in a secret location, remained untouched. Despite the threat, despite the fear coursing through her veins, her resolve only grew stronger. Angela sat in the television studio, her heart steady despite the gravity of what she was about to do. The bright lights felt warm on her face as she faced the camera, ready to expose the truth that had nearly cost her life. "These aren't just accusations," she said firmly into the camera. "I have proof." She began naming names, prominent judges, business leaders, politicians. Each name she spoke sent shockwaves through the nation. In his home office, Judge Daniel Santos watched the broadcast, his hands clasped tightly. Seeing Angela's courage moved something deep within him. He opened his laptop and began typing. Chapter 1. The day I sentenced an innocent woman to die. The next morning, his publisher announcement made headlines. Former judge to release tell-all memoir on corruption scandal. Detective Carla Reyes and Noah Fields met in their makeshift war room, walls covered with photos and documents. "This is just the beginning," Carla said, pinning up new photos. "They'll fight back hard." "Let them," Noah replied, his voice determined. "We've got truth on our side." A week after the interview, Angela and Judge Santos met at a small park bench. The autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching under their feet. They sat in silence for a moment, watching children play nearby. "I wanted to thank you," Angela finally said, turning to face him. Santos looked surprised. "Thank me? After what I did?" "Not for that," she said softly. "For what you're doing now. For choosing truth over protection. For risking everything to make things right." Santos's eyes welled with tears. "I don't deserve your gratitude." "Maybe not," Angela agreed. "But you have it anyway, because you proved that people can change, that the system can change." They stood, knowing this might be their last meeting for a while. As they prepared to part ways, a young woman approached Angela, quietly handing her an envelope before disappearing into the crowd. Angela opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a photograph of a young man in prison orange, his eyes haunted but defiant. A sticky note attached read, "He's innocent too. Execution date, 3 months." She looked up, her jaw set with determination. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. If you enjoyed the story of Judge Daniela D. and Angela Monroe, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.